why 98% of human history dinner was a luxury. History for sleep. For most of human history, a full stomach was not something you could take for granted. It was something you worked for, waited for, sometimes suffered for, and occasionally never received at all. The idea that food would simply be available, that you could walk into a room, open a container, and eat something warm without effort or uncertainty, would have been incomprehensible to nearly every human being who ever lived. And yet, for most of us alive today, in the modern world, this is simply Tuesday. This is simply the unremarkable backdrop of our ordinary life. You're hungry, and so you eat. The hunger ends. You return to whatever you were doing before. The whole transaction takes minutes, sometimes seconds, and you rarely think about it again. But that ease, that effortlessness, that quiet assumption that food will always be there, it is one of the strangest and most historically unprecedented conditions any human being has ever lived inside. And it raises a quiet question, one worth sitting with for a while before sleep. What did it mean for the overwhelming majority of human history to be hungry? What did it feel like to live in a body designed by evolution not for abundance, but for scarcity? And what did humans actually do across 200,000 years of existence when the question of dinner had no certain answer? To begin to understand this, we have to step back very far. We have to leave behind everything we know about kitchens, markets, grocery stores, scheduled meal times. We have to travel back into a world that our bodies still partly remember, even if our minds have largely forgotten it. A world of grasslands and forests and coastlines, of seasonal rhythms and unpredictable harvests, of long days spent searching and long nights spent uncertain. A world in which food was not a given but a question, and in which the answer to that question shaped everything about how humans lived, moved, thought, and felt. The human species, Homo sapiens as we are formally named, emerged somewhere in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago, though some estimates now push that date back further, to perhaps 300,000 years. For the vast majority of that time, our ancestors did not farm. They did not raise animals for slaughter. They did not store grain in clay pots or bake bread in stone ovens. They lived as hunter-gatherers, moving across landscapes in small bands, following the rhythms of animals and plants, eating what the world offered and going without when it did not. Agriculture, the practice of deliberately cultivating crops and managing livestock, emerged only around 10,000 years ago in what scientists call the Neolithic Revolution. If we imagine the full span of human existence as a single day of 24 hours, agriculture arrived only in the final hour, perhaps even the final 40 minutes. Everything before that long, slow, uncertain stretch of time was lived without it. This means that for approximately 98% of human history, dinner was not a planned event. It was not a scheduled comfort at the end of a working day. It was something that had to be earned, searched for, discovered, competed for, processed by hand, and consumed quickly before it could be lost. The very concept of a meal, structured, predictable, gathering of food at a designated time, is, in the long arc of human evolution, an extremely new idea. Our bodies do not fully believe in it yet. Our biology was shaped in a world where meals were irregular, unpredictable, and frequently delayed. And that shaping still echoes through every cell we carry. To appreciate what this means, consider the architecture of the human digestive system. fact, is built for flexibility. The stomach can expand enormously when food is available, accommodating a large intake in a single sitting. It can also shrink and quiet itself during periods of fasting, conserving energy, slowing metabolic processes, reducing the signals of hunger that would otherwise become unbearable. The liver stores glycogen, a form of sugar that can be released steadily into the bloodstream to maintain energy levels during hours or even days of reduced food intake. The body can break down stored fat for fuel, a process called ketosis, which kicks in when carbohydrate sources run low. The human body is, in a very real sense, a machine designed to tolerate going without. It is not designed for 3 meals a day. It is designed for feasts followed by fasts, abundance followed by scarcity, fullness followed by long stretches of simply managing. From an evolutionary perspective, the body's relationship with hunger is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. Every adaptation that feels uncomfortable to us today, the gnawing sensation of an empty stomach, the difficulty concentrating when we have not eaten, the way our mood shifts when hunger goes unaddressed, these were features, not bugs, in an ancestral environment. Hunger was a signal that prompted action. It was the body's way of saying, stop resting, start searching. Move to the next valley, look for routes along the riverbank, track the herd that passed through yesterday. Hunger was motivational in the most fundamental sense. It kept early humans alive, not by making them comfortable, but by making stillness uncomfortable. Imagine then what it would have been like to be a hunter-gatherer in the African savannah 100,000 years ago. You wake before dawn, not in a bed but on the ground, perhaps on a mat of dried grass or animal hide, surrounded by the sounds of your band. 8, 10, 15 people, perhaps a few more. The air is cool. You're not immediately hungry because your body has learned, over millions of years of evolutionary refinement, to suppress hunger during sleep, preserving energy for waking activity. But as the light comes and the camp stirs, the awareness of your body's needs begins to surface. You ate yesterday, perhaps. Some tubers dug from the earth, a handful of berries that were just beginning to ripen, a piece of smoked meat from a small animal killed 2 days before. Or perhaps you did not eat much yesterday at all. Perhaps the day before was a lean one. The question of today's food is not settled. It is open. It is something you will have to answer with your feet, your eyes, your knowledge, and your patience. Anthropologists who have studied modern hunter-gatherer societies, peoples like the Kungsan of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, or the Aboriginal groups of Australia before widespread contact, have consistently found that food acquisition is not a constant preoccupation but a periodic one. The idea, popular in earlier decades of anthropology, that hunter-gatherers spent all their time desperately searching for food has been largely revised. In reality, most hunter-gatherer groups work fewer hours per day securing food than modern humans work in offices or factories. The rest of the time is spent in socializing, resting, crafting tools, caring for children, and the many small tasks of daily life. But this does not mean food was always abundant. It means that hunter-gatherers were skilled at reading their environments, at knowing when and where food would be available, and at calibrating their efforts accordingly. It also means that during lean seasons, the dry months, the cold months, the seasons when animals migrated away and roots were buried too deep to find, food could become genuinely scarce. And when scarcity arrived, people went hungry in ways that were not merely uncomfortable, but physiologically significant. The anthropologist Marshall Salins famously described hunter-gatherer societies as the original affluent societies, arguing that their needs were few and their means of meeting those needs were generally adequate. This observation is partly true and worth understanding carefully. In terms of time and effort, many hunter-gatherer groups did not struggle every waking moment to survive. In that sense, Salins was right, but his framing has sometimes been misread to suggest that hunger was rare or trivial, and this is not accurate. What is more precise is to say that hunger was normal, expected and regularly experienced part of life. Not a crisis in most cases, but a companion, a condition that came and went with the seasons, with the success or failure of the hunt, with the generosity or indifference of the landscape in any given week. To be a hunter-gatherer was to know hunger personally, intimately, in the way that modern people know traffic or fatigue. It was not exotic or exceptional. It was simply part of what being alive in a body meant. The evidence from archaeology supports this picture clearly. Studies of skeletal remains from prehistoric populations reveal signs of nutritional stress at various life stages. Growth interruptions visible in bone density, enamel defects in teeth called Harris lines, and hyperplastic marks that form during periods of reduced nutrition in childhood and adolescence. These are not rare findings in ancient populations, they are common. They appear across geographic regions and time periods, from early Homo sapiens in Africa to later populations in Europe and Asia. The bodies of our ancestors recorded in their very bones and teeth the experience of going without. Food insecurity was not an aberration in ancient life. It was woven into the biological fabric of what it meant to be human. If we look deeper into the nutritional patterns of ancient peoples, we find something interesting and somewhat counterintuitive. Hunter-gatherers did not tend to suffer from the chronic diseases of malnutrition, the severe protein deficiencies, the vitamin deficiency diseases like scurvy or pellagra, that became common after the adoption of agriculture. Before farming, people ate a wide variety of foods. Their diet was diverse by necessity. In any given week, a hunter-gatherer group might consume dozens of different plant species, several types of animal protein, insects, eggs, honey when it could be found, and various tubers and roots that provided different micronutrients. This diversity protected them against the specific deficiencies that come from over-reliance on a single staple food. What they lacked was not variety. What they lacked was predictability. They could not be certain that any of these foods would be available on any given day. The abundance and the scarcity were both part of the same system. Contrast this with what happened after agriculture arrived. The Neolithic Revolution brought, paradoxically, both more food security in some respects and a significant decline in diet quality and nutritional diversity in others. When people began cultivating grains, wheat, barley, rice, maize, depending on the region, they created a reliable caloric base that could support larger populations. But they also narrowed their diet dramatically. Instead of dozens of food species, many agricultural communities came to depend on a handful of staple crops. Skeletal evidence from early agricultural populations consistently shows an increase in nutritional deficiency markers compared to the hunter-gatherer populations that preceded them. Early farmers were, on average, shorter than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, a sign of reduced nutritional quality during growth. They showed higher rates of deptylcaries from the increased carbohydrate consumption. They showed more evidence of specific deficiencies. Agriculture fed more mouths, but in some ways it fed them less well. This is one of the great paradoxes of human nutritional history, and it is worth sitting with quietly. The development that we tend to think of as the moment when humans escape the precariousness of the food supply, farming, the ability to grow your own food, actually introduced new forms of nutritional vulnerability, even as it reduced certain kinds of uncertainty. Famine became possible in ways it had not been before, because entire communities now depended on harvests that could fail. If the rains did not come, if a blight struck the wheat, if insects consumed the stored grain, the consequences were catastrophic in ways that scattered bands of hunter-gatherers are rarely experienced. Hunter-gatherers could move when food became scarce. Farmers could not. They were tied to their fields, to their animals, to their stored provisions. And when those provisions failed, people died in large numbers. But we are moving ahead of ourselves. Let us return to the deep past, to the long, slow centuries before farming, when the question of dinner was answered not by seasons of planting and harvest, but by the daily negotiation between human intelligence and the natural world. One of the most important things to understand about how early humans obtained food is the concept of dietary flexibility. The human body is what biologists call an omnivore in the fullest sense of that word, not merely capable of eating both plants and animals, but capable of deriving nutrition from an enormous range of sources in widely varying proportions across widely varying environments. This flexibility is one of the defining features of our species. It's what allowed Homo sapiens to colonize environments as different as tropical rainforests and Arctic tundras, coastal deserts and high mountain plateaus. No other large primate achieved this geographic range. One of the primary reasons Homo sapiens did is that our digestive systems could work with whatever those environments had to offer. In tropical forests, early humans gathered fruits, nuts, insects, tubers, and small animals. Along coastlines, they exploited shellfish, fish, seabirds, and marine mammals. In grassland environments, they followed large herbivore herds, eating the meat and organs of animals like aurochs, bison, and some various species of antelope. In northern environments, during cold periods, they relied more heavily on fat and protein from large game, the fat being particularly critical because fat provides more than twice the caloric energy of carbohydrates or protein per unit of weight. In each environment, the specific mix of foods differed dramatically, but the underlying principle was always the same. Eat what is available in whatever proportion it exists, and the body will find a way to extract what it needs. This flexibility came with a cost, however, and that cost is directly relevant to the question of hunger. A body capable of deriving nutrition from many different sources must be capable of managing periods when none of those sources is readily available. It must be able to function, think, move, and survive during gaps between successful food acquisition events. The human body's remarkable capacity for enduring hunger, its ability to fast for extended periods without catastrophic failure, is not incidental to our evolutionary history. It is central to it. We are descended from individuals who survived lean times, the ones who could not tolerate extended hunger, who became incapacitated too quickly, or whose metabolisms could not shift fluidly between fed and fasted states, were less likely to pass their genes forward. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the human metabolic system was refined by exactly these pressures. Consider what happens in the human body during an extended period of food scarcity. In the first several hours after the last meal, blood glucose levels decline gradually. the liver begins releasing stored glycogen to maintain glucose supply. After roughly 12 to 16 hours, glycogen stores begin to run low and the body shifts toward fat metabolism with increasing emphasis. Fatty acids are released from adipose tissue and transported to the liver, where they are converted into ketone bodies, molecules that can cross the blood-brain barrier and fuel the brain in the absence of glucose. This shift into ketosis is not a malfunction. It is an elegant designed response to scarcity. While it has been present in our biology for far longer than the history of our species, it is shared by many other mammals. It is a metabolic memory of the times when food was not available on demand. What is particularly interesting from a neuroscientific perspective is what happens to cognition during mild to moderate food restriction. Many people who have experienced intermittent fasting report, after an initial period of adjustment, a heightened sense of mental clarity and focus. This is not coincidental or merely psychological. There is a biological logic to it. In an environment where food must be sought actively, a hungry brain needs to be a sharp brain. It needs to be attentive to patterns in the landscape, alert to animal tracks, capable of planning and strategizing about where to move next. A brain that became foggy and ineffective the moment caloric intake dropped would have been a profound liability in the ancestral environment. Instead, moderate hunger appears to activate certain cognitive systems, particularly those associated with attention, pattern recognition, and goal-directed behavior. The body knows, on some ancient level, that hunger is a problem to be solved by thinking and moving, not by shutting down. This raises an important question about how early humans organized their days around the challenge of food. Unlike modern people, who often eat on fixed schedule regardless of actual hunger, breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, because that is what the clock says and what social convention expects. Early humans almost certainly ate in a pattern much more responsive to circumstance. You ate when food was available. You ate as much as you could when it was, because you could not be sure when it would be again. You went without when it was not, and your body adjusted. This pattern, often described by modern nutritional researchers as intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating, is increasingly recognized as more closely aligned with our biological heritage than the constant feeding pattern that dominates contemporary life. The anthropological evidence from studies of living hunter-gatherer groups gives us a window into these ancient rhythms. Among the Hadza of northern Tanzania, one of the few remaining populations who live primarily by hunting and gathering, food intake varies dramatically from day to day. A successful hunt might result in a large communal meal with significant amounts of animal protein and fat. But successful hunts are not daily occurrences. On days without large game, meals might consist largely of tubers dug from dry ground, small amounts of berry-like fruits, or baobab fruit processed laboriously by hand. On some days, food intake is minimal. Hadza adults appear to spend roughly 3 to 5 hours per day in active food acquisition, considerably less than the modern 8-hour workday. But the results of those hours are highly variable. The body must be capable of living well on varying amounts. What the Hadza and similar groups reveal is that the human body is not merely capable of tolerating variation in food intake. It may actually function optimally with some of that variation. Metabolic researchers studying groups with traditional diets and activity patterns consistently find low rates of the chronic diseases most closely associated with modern Western food patterns. Type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity-related conditions, insulin resistance. These conditions are not simply diseases of age. They are, to a significant degree, diseases of metabolic mismatch, of a body shaped by scarcity being asked to cope with conditions of constant abundance. The human insulin system, for instance, evolved in the context where large glucose loads were unusual. Honey, ripe fruit at peak season, the glycogen in animal liver, these provided occasional bursts of high sugar intake. But they were not continuous, they were episodic. The metabolic machinery that manages blood sugar was designed for those episodes, not for a daily pattern of 3 carbohydrate-heavy meals plus snacks. Let us pause here and think about what dinner specifically meant in the ancient world. Not just food in general, not just the concept of eating, but the particular event of an evening meal, the gathering at the end of the day, the communal sharing of what had been found or killed, the closing of the day's nutritional account. In modern life, dinner occupies a particular social and psychological space. It is often the most social meal of the day, the moment when a household gathers, when the day's events are discussed, when a certain kind of comfort is sought and usually found. There is something deeply ritualistic about the evening meal in almost every culture on Earth, and that universality is not accidental. It speaks to something very old. Among hunter-gatherer groups, the evening is reliably a time of social gathering. After the day's activities, as the foraging, the hunting, the tool-making, the tending of children, people come together at the fire. In groups like the Fakungsean, observers have noted that the evening fireside gathering is one of the most important social institutions in the community. Stories are told, information is shared, social bonds are reinforced, and food, when available, is eaten communally. The sharing of food is not incidental to this gathering, it is central to it. Food sharing is one of the most consistent and widespread behaviours in hunter-gatherer societies around the world, and it appears to be among the oldest features of human social life. There is archaeological evidence suggesting that food sharing goes back at least to the earliest members of our genus Homo, and possibly further into our ancestral lineage. But here is the important point. Not every evening gathering ended with everyone having eaten enough. In a world without refrigeration, without grain storage, without domesticated animals that could be slaughtered on demand, the evening meal was contingent. It happened when the hunt succeeded, when the gathered plants provided sufficient calories, when the season was generous. It did not happen fully, satisfyingly, certainly, every single night. There were evenings when the fire burned and people sat together and told stories and went to sleep with stomachs that were not full. Evenings when the day's foraging had produced enough to take the edge off hunger, but not to extinguish it. Evenings when children fell asleep still hungry, and adults lay awake in the dark, listening to the sounds of the night, waiting for tomorrow to offer something the day had not. This is not a description of failure or suffering in the extraordinary sense. It is a description of the ordinary texture of ancient life. Hunger was not a catastrophe in the daily routine of a hunter-gatherer. It was a condition to be managed, a state to be endured with patience, a signal that tomorrow would require a different strategy. The emotional and psychological relationship with hunger in the ancestral world was necessarily different from the one that most modern people in food-secure environments carry. Today, many people in wealthy nations experience even mild hunger as something requiring immediate correction, a small inconvenience to be eliminated as quickly as possible. The body's hunger signal has been so thoroughly uncoupled from any real threat to survival that it registers as an annoyance, not as information about the state of the world. For our ancestors, hunger was information. It said, the landscape is currently not providing enough. It said, your body is drawing on reserves and those reserves are finite. It said, tomorrow, move differently, look in different places, try a different strategy. And the body listened, because there was no choice but to listen. The human nervous system in the ancestral environment was calibrated to hunger in a way that modern experience barely touches. The subtle shifts in mood, in motivation, in perceptual sharpness that accompany different states of nutrition were meaningful signals in a meaningful system. They were not to be immediately suppressed. They were to be heard. Evolutionary biologists and anthropologists sometimes use the term feast-famine cycling to describe the fundamental pattern of ancient human food intake. The idea is that our ancestors lived not in a constant middle state of moderate nutrition, but in a rhythmic oscillation between times of relative plenty and times of scarcity. After a successful large game hunt, there might be a period of genuine feasting. Large quantities of meat consumed over several days, organs eaten fresh because they would not keep, fat rendered and consumed because fat was the most calorically dense food available, and the body craved it after periods of lean eating. Then, as the meat was consumed and the carcass was fully processed, the band would return to a more variable diet of gathered plant foods, perhaps with small gossamer insects filling in the protein gaps, until the next significant hunting success. The feast-famine cycle appears in the archaeological record in various ways. Butchery sites, places where large animals were killed and processed, show evidence of intensive exploitation. Bones cracked for marrow, which was consumed for its fat content. Skulls opened for brain tissue. No part of the animal left unprocessed that could yield nutrition. These are not the behaviours of people who are merely peckish. They're the behaviours of people who understood on a deep intuitive and cultural level that abundance was temporary and should be fully utilised. Every calorie available in that carcass was a calorie that might not be available next week. The systematic, complete processing of large game animals speaks to a nutritional philosophy forged by generations of scarcity. Take everything now, because now may be all there is. The fat content of wild animals is also worth considering in this context. Wild game, the animals that early humans hunted on the African savanna, the grasslands of Europe and Asia, the forests and plains of the Americas after human migration there, tends to be much leaner than domesticated livestock. A wild deer or antelope carries a fraction of the body fat of a modern beef cow. This means that the caloric density of hunter-gatherer animal foods was lower per unit of mass than what most modern people eating meat consume. To achieve the caloric intake necessary to fuel an active hunting and gathering lifestyle, early humans needed to eat more frequently from the available food sources. But more critically, when they did find fat, in organ meats, in bone marrow, in the occasional fatty game animal, in seasonal foods like nuts and fatty fish, they prioritized it intensely. The human craving for fat is not a modern excess, it is an ancient wisdom. The body knows what the history of scarcity taught it. Fat is rare, fat is dense, fat keeps you alive when lean times come. This has interesting implications for understanding not just ancient eating, but the profound sensory pleasures of food. The reason a rich, fatty meal feels so deeply satisfying, almost soporific in its satisfaction, the kind of fullness that invites sleep, is not simply a matter of modern preference. is the signature of an ancient reward system, doing exactly what it was designed to do. When early humans consumed a large, calorically dense meal after days of relative scarcity, the appropriate biological response was intense pleasure followed by rest. The body needed to recover, to begin the work of storing what it could, to allow the digestive system to process what it had received. The satisfaction of a full stomach, the heaviness of satiation, the drift towards sleep, these are not weaknesses. They are physiological wisdom accumulated over 200,000 years of knowing though abundance is temporary and rest is necessary. Let us consider now the social dimensions of food scarcity in ancient communities. One of the most consistent findings across anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer societies is the strength of food-sharing norms. In virtually every documented hunter-gatherer group, food, particularly large game and the other high-value items, is shared widely across the band. A successful hunter does not keep the meat for himself and his immediate family. He brings it back to camp, where it's divided according to established cultural rules that ensure broad distribution. This is not mere altruism, though it has altruistic qualities. It is a form of risk management that has clear evolutionary logic. In a world where hunting success is unpredictable, any individual hunter will have both good days and bad days. Some weeks he will return with a large kill. Other weeks he will return empty-handed. By participating in a system of obligatory sharing, he ensures that when his hunt fails, others will share with him. He is in effect trading a portion of his surplus on good days for insurance against the bad days. The entire band functions as a mutual food security network, and this system is enforced not just by informal social expectation, but by quite strong cultural norms. In many hunter-gatherer groups, hoarding food, keeping more than you immediately need while others in the band go hungry, is one of the most serious social transgressions possible. It is the kind of behaviour that can get you excluded from the group. An exclusion from a small band of 50 people in an ancient environment is a near-death sentence. This is why the sharing of food in human societies has such deep emotional resonance that it extends far beyond the practical. Sharing a meal with someone is one of the most fundamentally bonding human activities. Refusing to share food is one of the most cutting social gestures. These feelings are not cultural artifacts of recent history. They're echoes of a very old system in which the social rules around food distribution were literally a matter of life and death. The warmth of a shared table, the comfort of eating with others, the particular intimacy of feeding someone you care for, these are not merely social customs. They are the emotional residue of hundreds of thousands of years, in which sharing food was how a community held itself together against the cold fact of scarcity. The archaeological record of early human campsites reveals much about the social nature of ancient eating. Hearths, firesites, where food was cooked and people gathered, are among the most consistent features found at ancient human campsites across Africa, Europe and Asia. The oldest known controlled use of fire dates back to roughly 1 million years ago in the early Homo lineage, though more intensive cooking appears to become common around 400,000 years ago and is essentially universal in Homo sapiens. The hearth is not just a cooking device. It is the centre of the social world. It is where the band gathers. It is where food is prepared and shared. It is where stories are told and disputes are resolved and the day's events are processed. The fire that cooked the food and the fire which the community sat with the same fire, and this is not incidental. Food and community were always the same project. Cooking itself represents one of the most important transitions in human nutritional history, and it is worth pausing to appreciate what it meant for the question of food availability. Raw plant foods are often difficult for the human digestive system to fully process. Many roots, tubers and seeds contain compounds that reduce their digestibility at the raw state. Enzyme inhibitors, tough fibrous coatings, phytase that bind minerals. Cooking breaks these compounds down, dramatically increasing the caloric and nutritional yield from the same raw materials. A cooked sweet potato provides substantially more usable energy than a raw one of the same size. Cooked grains and legumes are digestible where raw ones are barely so. By cooking their food, early humans were effectively increasing the efficiency of their food supply without increasing the food itself. The same landscape with the same plants and animals available yielded more nutrition per unit to a group that cooked than to one that did not. The biological evidence that cooking has been part of human life for a very long time is written into our anatomy. Compared to our closest primate relatives, humans have relatively small intestines for our body size. Chimpanzees, who eat primarily raw plant foods, have substantially larger gut volumes relative to body size. The smaller human gut reflects a digestive system that does not need to process large quantities of raw, difficult-to-digest vegetation, because cooking has already done much of the digestive work externally. Our teeth are also smaller than those of other great apes, reflecting the same shift toward cooked food, which requires less chewing force to process. Our jaws are relatively gracile. These are the anatomical signatures of a species that learned to outsource part of digestion to fire, and learned it long enough ago that evolution had time to respond. But cooking, while it increased nutritional efficiency, did not eliminate scarcity. It made the food that was available more nutritionally accessible. It did not make food available when it was not. And so, even with the use of fire, even with the cognitive sophistication to plan hunts, coordinate gathering, process food skillfully, and share resources across the band, early humans still lived with uncertainty about whether tomorrow's meal would come. The hearth fire might burn every night, but what was cooked over it varied enormously with the season, the luck of the hunt, and the generosity of the local landscape. Seasonality is a concept that modern people in food-secure environments have largely disconnected from. In a world of global supply chains and climate-controlled storage, most foods are available year-round regardless of their natural growing season. Strawberries in December, fresh fish from the other side of the world, grains stored for years in controlled environments. These have made seasonality a preference rather than a reality for much of the modern world. But for virtually all of human evolutionary history, seasonality was the central organizing principle of the food supply. What you could eat depended entirely on what time of year it was, and the rhythm of scarcity and abundance mapped, almost perfectly, onto the rhythm of the seasons. In most environments, late summer and autumn were the most abundant seasons. Fruits ripened, seeds matured, animals put on weight for winter. In temperate and subarctic regions, the autumn period was often one of genuine caloric surplus. The brief window when gathering and hunting could yield more than was needed on a given day, and when the body itself could store reserves of fat against the coming cold. Winter, by contrast, was typically the leanest season. In cold climates, plant foods largely disappeared. Animal prey was scattered and often lean, having depleted their own fat reserves through the cold months. The human communities that survived northern winters did so partly on stored fat in their own bodies, accumulated deliberately during the autumn abundance. This is one of the reasons why the human body has such a powerful response to caloric density in food. The desire for rich, fatty, sweet foods, often characterized as a flaw or an indulgence in contemporary nutritional culture, is, from an evolutionary perspective, a seasonal preparation response. It is the body saying, "This abundance may not last. Store what you can." In an ancestral environment, this response was adaptive. It prepared the body for the inevitable lean times ahead. And in a modern environment where these lean times never come, the same response drives the accumulation of fat stores that have nowhere useful to be deployed. The body is doing exactly what evolution designed it to do. It is the environment that changed, not the body's instructions. If we look deeper into the behavioral and psychological dimensions of how ancient humans coped with food scarcity, we find a remarkable web of cognitive and social adaptations. The ability to plan ahead, to anticipate future food needs, and take actions today that will improve the likelihood of eating tomorrow is one of the defining features of human cognition. While many animal species cache food or make seasonal preparations for winter, the human capacity for forward planning in relation to food is exceptionally sophisticated. Early humans used detailed knowledge of their landscape, which plants would ripen where and when, which watering holes animals were likely to visit in dry seasons, which mountain pieces the herds would use on their seasonal migrations, to position themselves advantageously. This was not instinct. It was knowledge, accumulated through careful observation and transmitted culturally across generations. The transmission of food knowledge between generations was one of the most critical cultural functions in ancient human societies. Children learned by watching adults. They learned the names and properties of hundreds of plant species, which ones were edible, which ones were toxic, which ones were edible only at certain stages of ripeness, which ones required a specific preparation to neutralize harmful compounds. They learned the behavior of prey animals, their tracks, their signs, their patterns, the telltale marks of a feeding site or a sleeping area. They learned the landscape itself, its features and its meaning, the way a particular hillside collected moisture and therefore might harbour edible plants long after nearby areas had dried out. This accumulated ecological knowledge was not written down. It was oral, practical, embodied, and deeply social. And it represented humanity's primary defence against starvation. It is significant that across virtually all hunter-gatherer cultures ever studied, there is a strong tradition of storytelling around food. Stories about successful hunts, about plants that could be found in particular places, about the times when food was scarce and how the community managed, about the spiritual significance of the animals and plants upon which life depended. These stories were not entertainment in the sense of escapism. They were practical knowledge repositories, wrapped in narrative form because narrative is the most powerful encoding mechanism the human mind possesses. A story sticks. A list of facts about which plants grow where and when fades. A story about the time your grandmother found the grove of wild yams that saved the community during the terrible dry season 3 generations ago. That story lives in memory, and lives in the memory of your children after you tell it to them, and in the memory of their children after that. This is one of the reasons that food occupies such a central place in the mythological and spiritual traditions of indigenous cultures worldwide. Food is not merely physical sustenance in these traditions, it is the gift of the world to the community. It is the manifestation of the relationship between humans and the rest of the living world. The hunt is not merely a caloric extraction event. It is a negotiation, a relationship, a reciprocal exchange that must be approached with respect and gratitude. The plant that gives itself to the hand that gathers, it is understood in many indigenous cosmologies as a being with its own existence and its own terms, not merely a passive resource to be consumed. These spiritual frameworks, which might seem merely metaphorical or ceremonial to a secular modern eye, encode a profound practical wisdom about the necessity of caring for the landscape that feeds you, a community that hunts respectfully, that does not take more than it needs, that allows populations of prey animals to recover, that manages plant resources sustainably, that community survives long term. One that treats the landscape as an infinite available resource to be maximally exploited. That community depletes its own food base and collapses. The relationship between early humans and their food landscape was therefore not simply one of extraction. It was at its best a managed relationship. Many anthropologists now believe that hunter-gatherers were far more active in shaping their food environments than was once assumed. The deliberate burning of grasslands and forests to encourage new plant growth and attract game animals has been documented in many traditional cultures. The selective harvesting of plant species, leaving enough to reproduce and maintain population, is common practice in surviving, say, hunter-gatherer groups. The management of certain trees and water sources, the creation of pathways that facilitate travel between food areas, the leaving of certain areas unharvested during sensitive periods. These are all forms of food landscape management that fall short of full agriculture, but represent something more than passive dependence on what nature provides. The distinction between hunting-gathering and early forms of food management is actually less sharp than the traditional textbook narrative suggests. The Neolithic Revolution, the transition to full agriculture, was not a sudden leap from completely passive dependence on wild foods to active cultivation. It was the end point of a long, gradual process of intensifying human relationships with certain plant and animal species. In the millennia just before the emergence of formal agriculture, in what archaeologists call the proto-agricultural or intensive foraging period, many groups were already manipulating their food landscapes in sophisticated ways, transplanting useful plants to more accessible locations, clearing vegetation around productive food trees, repeatedly returning to the same resource patches and managing them actively. The line between foraging and early cultivation was blurry and was crossed gradually over generations. But throughout this long transition, the fundamental uncertainty of the food supply remained. Even intensive foragers who managed their landscape skillfully were still subject to the variability of weather, disease, pest pressures, and the countless other factors that could disrupt the food supply in any given season. The safety net of a truly reliable, large-scale agricultural system was still in the future. And even when agriculture arrived, as we have noted, it did not immediately solve the problem of scarcity. It transformed its nature, replacing the daily uncertainty of hunter-gatherer life with the seasonal uncertainty of crop success and failure. But it did not eliminate it. The history of famine in agricultural societies is long and terrible. From ancient Mesopotamia to medieval Europe to modern times, crop failures have periodically resulted in mass starvation on a scale that scattered bands of hunter-gatherers rarely experienced. The caloric math of agriculture is worth understanding in this context. Agriculture allowed any given piece of land to support many more people than hunting and gathering could. A hectare of land under cultivation can produce far more human food than a hectare of wilderness managed by foragers. This higher caloric productivity per unit of land is what allowed agricultural populations to grow rapidly and eventually to displace hunter-gatherer populations wherever the two came into contact. More people could be fed. But those people were fed by a narrower range of foods, from a system more vulnerable to large-scale catastrophic failure in communities that were now too large and too sedentary to move when the local food supply failed. The transformation of the food supply that agriculture represented was a trade-off, and not an entirely favourable one for the individuals living within it. There is a fascinating intellectual debate among evolutionary biologists and anthropologists about whether the adoption of agriculture was, in any meaningful sense, a choice, or whether it was, as the anthropologist Jared Diamond provocatively argued, the worst mistake in the history of the human race. Diamond's argument, stated in simplified form, is that agriculture led to increased disease burden, reduced diet quality, more labour per person, more social inequality, and new forms of political domination and exploitation that hunter-gatherer egalitarianism had largely avoided. From the perspective of individual human well-being, the argument goes, early farmers were worse off than the hunter-gatherers who preceded them in many measurable respects. Whether or not one accepts Diamond's dramatic framing, the underlying observations are largely accurate. Early agricultural populations were shorter, had more dental decay, showed more evidence of nutritional deficiency, lived in more crowded and epidemiologically dangerous conditions, and worked harder for their calories than comparable hunter-gatherer populations. The advantages of agriculture, higher population density, the ability to store food against seasonal scarcity, the foundation for the development of writing, cities, technology, and eventually the entire edifice of modern civilization, accrued more to the species level and long-term trajectory of human culture than to the individuals living through the transition. For those individuals, the shift to farming was often, in terms of daily well-being, a step down. But let us not romanticize the hunter-gatherer past either. The fact that ancient foragers showed fewer signs of specific nutritional deficiency diseases does not mean that they did not suffer from hunger. They did. The fact that they showed fewer signs of the chronic diseases of agricultural and industrial civilization does not mean that they were not subject to other serious threats to health and survival: infectious disease, traumatic injury from hunting and other physical activities, exposure to the elements, the dangers of childbirth and infant mortality. Life expectancy in ancient populations was short by modern standards, though this is partly a function of high infant and child mortality, rather than universal short adult lifespans. Adults who survived to their 30s and 40s in ancient populations could, in good conditions, live into their 60s or beyond. But many did not survive the first years of life, and this statistical reality shaped the experience of ancient communities profoundly. Infant and child mortality in ancient populations was closely tied to food availability. Mothers who were nutritionally stressed produced less milk or milk of lower quality. Children weaned too early, as they often were when a new pregnancy began, since the nutritional cost of supporting both a nursing toddler and a new pregnancy simultaneously was severe. were much less vulnerable to malnutrition and infection. The spacing of births in hunter-gatherer populations, often achieved through a combination of extended breastfeeding, physical activity levels that suppressed ovulation, and other cultural practices, served in part as a form of nutritional resource management. Having babies too close together in a world of food insecurity meant the likelihood of being unable to feed the older child adequately when the new one arrived. Birth spacing was not merely a reproductive strategy, it was a food security strategy. This connection between reproduction and nutrition illuminates something important about the human body's response to chronic food scarcity. In conditions of sustained caloric restriction, the human reproductive system responds by reducing fertility. Women who fall below a certain body fat threshold, which is associated with, though not entirely explained by, body fat percentage, cease to ovulate regularly. This is not a malfunction, it is a resource allocation decision by the body. Pregnancy and lactation are metabolically expensive undertakings. In a body that is already resource stressed, committing to another pregnancy is a risk that might kill both mother and child. The body's response is to delay reproduction until conditions improve. In modern clinical settings, this response manifests in the amenorrhea that is a common feature of anorexia nervosa, and in the menstrual irregularities seen in female athletes with very low body fat. These are the same ancient mechanisms, expressing themselves in contemporary contexts. From an evolutionary perspective, this reproductive response to scarcity is one of many places where the body's ancient programming intersects with modern life in complex ways. Modern women in wealthy countries sometimes experience this mechanism in unexpected contexts. Elite athletes, dancers, models, or anyone whose lifestyle produces a very low body fat percentage may find that their reproductive cycles become irregular in ways that can be distressing and medically significant. Understanding that this is an ancient protective mechanism, not a disease, does not make it less problematic in the modern context, but it does illuminate something important about what the human body is and where it came from. The question of how ancient humans thought about food, not just how they obtained it, but how they understood it cognitively and experientially, is one that archaeologists and anthropologists approach through several converging lines of evidence. Art provides one window, the cave paintings of Europe, dating from roughly 40,000 to 12,000 years ago, are dominated by images of large animals, bison, horses, aurochs, mammoths, deer. These are not merely decorative representations. They likely held ritual and cognitive significance related to the hunt. They may have been part of ceremonies intended to ensure hunting success, or to honour the animals upon which human survival depended, or simply to process and express the emotional and cognitive weight of the relationship between humans and prey that was central to daily life. The animals that fed the community were also the animals that filled the community's visual imagination. Food and meaning were inseparable. Burial practices also provide indirect evidence about ancient relationships with food. Many ancient graves contain what appear to be offerings of food, animal bones placed alongside the body, ochre-covered shells that may have held food residues, arrangements that suggest the community was providing for the dead person's needs in whatever afterlife was imagined. This practice of providing food for the dead is one of the most widespread behaviours in the archaeological record of ancient humans, appearing in contexts from Neanderthal burials to early Homo sapiens mortuary sites to later prehistoric cultures around the world. It suggests that food was understood as a fundamental necessity, not just of living bodies, but of whatever form of existence the community imagined for their dead. Food was so central to the meaning of being alive that being dead, in many ancient cosmologies, was understood as simply a different kind of living, one that still required sustenance. Let us return now to the physical reality of hunger itself and to what it meant experientially to go through a day or several days without adequate food in an ancient context. The modern experience of hunger for most people in food-secure environments is so far from the ancestral experience that it barely deserves the same name. Skipping a meal because you are too busy to eat, feeling a little lightheaded before lunch, being mildly irritable when dinner is delayed. These are very different experiences from the sustained, deepening hunger of an ancient person who had eaten little for 2 or 3 days and was uncertain when that would change. The physiological experience of sustained hunger unfolds in stages. In the first 12 to 24 hours, the body manages relatively smoothly on glycogen reserves and early fat mobilization. Energy is maintained, mood may be somewhat lower than normal, and focus may shift toward food-seeking thoughts. But the body is not yet in crisis. From 24 to 72 hours, the body increasingly relies on fat metabolism and ketone production. The sense of hunger after an initial intensification often paradoxically decreases somewhat as the body adapts to the fasted state and as ketones begin to supply the brain's needs. This is a well-documented feature of extended fasting. The hunger is most acute in the first day or two, and then often becomes more manageable as metabolic adaptation proceeds. This adaptation would have been essential in the ancestral environment, where multi-day periods of reduced food intake were not uncommon, and where a person who became completely incapacitated after one missed meal would have been at severe survival disadvantage. Beyond 3 days without adequate nutrition, the physical and cognitive effects become more significant. The body begins to break down muscle tissue more aggressively for gluconeogenesis, the production of glucose from non-sugar sources. Physical strength decreases. Immune function may begin to decline. The capacity for sustained physical exertion is reduced. Cognitive functions that require significant energy, complex planning, extended attention, abstract reasoning, may begin to degrade. Yet even in this state, the human body maintains remarkable functional capacity. Accounts from people who have experienced extended starvation, whether in survival situations or in the context of historical famine, consistently note that the body's basic survival instincts, the drive to find food, the alertness to opportunity, the ability to move when necessary, remain intact long after comfort and even cognitive ease have been compromised. This resilience is the direct product of evolutionary selection in a world where food scarcity was regular and predictable. The human body built its operating hierarchy around survival during food shortages. Non-essential functions, reproductive fertility as we discussed, high-level cognitive processing, immune responses to non-urgent threats, are scaled back. Essential survival functions, basic locomotion, sensory awareness, the drive to seek food, are protected as long as possible. The body prioritizes the actions most likely to end the scarcity. Find food. Eat it. That is the core imperative around which the human metabolic system has been organized for hundreds of thousands of years. What archaeology and anthropology tell us is that this resilience was regularly tested. Not every day and not always severely, but over the course of a life lived in the ancient world, every person who reached adulthood had almost certainly experienced extended periods of food restriction at some point. The universal distribution of Harris lines in ancient skeletal populations, those growth interruptions that mark periods of significant nutritional stress, tells us that these experiences began in childhood. Children who survived to adulthood in ancient populations had typically already experienced at least one serious episode of food restriction, one period when the body paused its growth to conserve resources. The scars of those experiences were written in bone. They survived into adulthood and old age, permanently marking the skeleton with the memory of hunger. This is one of the most quietly profound things that archaeology can tell us about ancient life. The bones of a person who died 40,000 years ago, examined in a laboratory today, carry within their physical structure the record of every significant nutritional stress that person experienced. They tell us, if we know how to read them, about the lean winters and the failed hunts and the dry seasons when the roots were scarce and the berries did not come. They tell us, without words, what it meant to be alive in a body that was always negotiating with the world for what it needed. The question of plant foods in the ancient diet deserves careful attention because there is sometimes a tendency in popular discussions of ancestral nutrition to focus almost exclusively on meat, and to imagine early humans as primarily carnivorous. The evidence does not support this picture. While the specific balance of plant and animal foods varied enormously across different populations and environments, plant foods were a significant component of the diet for virtually all hunter-gatherer groups. In tropical and subtropical environments, plant foods often provided the majority of calories. Even in colder environments where large game was more central, seasonal plant foods, berries, roots, green shoots in spring, seeds and nuts in autumn, provided important nutritional variety and specific micronutrients that meat alone cannot supply. Tuber is perhaps the most important plant food in the story of human evolution that does not receive adequate attention in popular accounts. Starchy underground storage organs, tubers, corms, rhizomes, bulbs, provided a reliable, calorie-dense, year-round food source in many of the environments where early Homo sapiens and their ancestors lived. Unlike most above-ground plant foods, which are seasonal and often fragile, underground storage organs are available across seasons and are relatively protected from competitors and weather variability by virtue of being underground. A population that knew where the tubers were and how to dig them had a nutritional security that above-ground plant foragers did not. There is compelling evidence from archaeological sites across Africa that early humans exploited tubers heavily, and some researchers have proposed that tuberous plant foods played a critical role in supporting the large brain development that characterizes Homo sapiens, not simply because tubers provided carbohydrates for the brain, but because the cognitive demands of finding and processing them may have driven the development of the very intelligence that now contemplates its own evolutionary history. Water, too, was part of the food security equation in ways that modern people rarely consider. In many of the environments where early humans lived, water was not available in the reliable, continuous way that modern piped water supply is. Access to water determined the viability of any given area as a living site. The distribution of permanent water sources, springs, rivers that did not dry up seasonally, lakes, shaped human movement patterns and social organization. Hunter-gatherer groups typically had detailed knowledge of water sources across their range, and movement between those sources was a central feature of their seasonal routine. and water availability was directly connected to food availability, because animals congregate around water and many plant foods require moist soil or are associated with riparian environments, as in very dry environments, such as the Kalahari where the Ainkungsan live. Certain plant species take on extraordinary importance as water sources. The summer melon, various species of wild cucumber, and notably the bivalve, the water-storing plant, were traditional sources of water during dry periods. The odd knowledge of where such plants could be found and the cultural and practical techniques for accessing their water content represents a form of food and water security technology that is elegantly adapted to a difficult environment. It is knowledge that was built up over generations of observation and maintained through cultural transmission. It is, in a sense, applied ecology of remarkable sophistication. The cognitive demands of hunter-gatherer life, the need to maintain detailed knowledge of landscapes, seasons, plant and animal species, water sources, social rules and relationships, navigation, tool manufacture, and the countless other skills required for survival are now recognized by cognitive scientists as being substantial. The old image of ancient humans as cognitively simple, driven primarily by instinct, doing roughly what any sufficiently hungry animal would do, has been entirely replaced by the recognition that hunter-gatherer life demanded and developed a richly sophisticated human cognition. The detailed ecological knowledge that hunter-gatherer communities maintained, what researchers call traditional ecological knowledge or folk ecology, has been found in many cases to be as accurate and detailed as formal scientific ecology for the environments it covers. People who navigated by stars, tracked animals over days, maintained mental maps of vast territories, managed complex social relationships across dozens of individuals, and processed hundreds of species of plants and animals in the context of their ecological relationships were not cognitively simple. They were cognitively sophisticated in ways that were perfectly matched to their environmental demands. What this means for our understanding of the food quest is that it was not merely physical, it was intellectual. Finding and securing food in the ancient world was a problem that required not just strong legs and sharp eyes. It's an active, engaged mind, one that was constantly processing environmental information, updating its models of where food might be found, planning strategies and contingencies, communicating and coordinating with other members of the band. The challenge of feeding oneself in a world without guaranteed food supply was, in a real sense, one of the primary engines driving human cognitive evolution. Our brains grew large, in significant part, because feeding us required larger brains. This is a humbling thought to sit with. The cognitive capacities that allow you to read, to contemplate complex ideas, to plan for the future, to imagine alternatives that do not yet exist. These capacities were shaped over millions of years by the challenge of finding something to eat in a world that did not always offer it readily. Every act of planning, every search through memory for relevant information, every update of a mental model based on new evidence. These are the same cognitive operations that your ancestors performed every day in the service of answering the most fundamental question: where is the food and how do we get it? There is something almost meditative about this thought as you settle towards sleep. The elaborate cognitive machinery that makes you capable of worry and wonder and language and memory was built, in its deepest foundations, by the problem of dinner, by the need to think more clearly, plan more carefully, remember more accurately, communicate more effectively, cooperate more smoothly. all in the service of finding enough to eat before the darkness came. The human mind is, among other things, the most sophisticated food-finding instrument that evolution has ever produced, and it has been so shaped by the experience of not always finding food that its very functioning is calibrated around the rhythms of hunger and satisfaction. The hormonal landscape of hunger and satiation is worth exploring here, because it offers a window into exactly how deeply ancient the food-finding drives are in human biology. Ghrelin, often called the hunger hormone, is produced primarily by the stomach lining when the stomach is empty. It acts on the brain, specifically on the hypothalamus, the ancient, evolutionarily old part of the brain that regulates fundamental bodily functions, to produce the sensation of hunger and to motivate food-seeking behaviour. Ghrelin also appears to have effects on learning and memory that specifically support food-related spatial memory, remembering where food was found before, how to get back to a location where food was available. This is not coincidental. The hormone of hunger also sharpens the memory systems most relevant to finding food again. Evolution built the hunger signal and the food-finding cognitive enhancement into the same chemical signal. On the other side of the equation, the hormone leptin is produced by fat cells in proportion to the amount of fat stored in the body. It acts on the hypothalamus to reduce hunger and increase the sense of satiation. When fat stores are high, leptin levels are high. Hunger is suppressed and the body is less motivated to seek food. When fat stores are low, leptin levels fall, hunger increases, and the body becomes more motivated. This system was designed for an environment where body fat levels varied with the seasons and with the success of food acquisition, where having low fat stores was a genuinely meaningful signal that food security was compromised and active seeking was necessary. In a modern environment where most people in wealthy countries maintain sufficient fat stores year-round, the leptin system never fully signals the security it was designed to signal, because the evolutionarily expected seasonal depletion of fat stores never occurs. The interaction between these hormonal systems, ghrelin, leptin, insulin, cortisol, and many others involved in metabolic regulation, constitutes one of the most complex and important regulatory systems in the human body. It was assembled over millions of years of evolutionary pressure in environments of intermittent food availability. It works beautifully in those environments. It is deeply confused by the modern environment of constant high-calorie food availability. And the diseases of metabolic dysregulation that are among the major causes of morbidity and mortality in modern industrialized societies, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, are, at their root, the diseases of a hormonal and metabolic system that evolved for scarcity being operated in a context of abundance. This is not a moralistic observation about the wickedness of modern food culture. It is a biological description of the mismatch between evolutionary programming and environmental reality. The same body that kept your ancestors alive through lean winters and failed hunts, through the long months when dinner was never guaranteed, is now operating in an environment its engineering never anticipated. It is doing what it was designed to do, prioritizing caloric intake, craving energy-dense foods, storing fat against the inevitable hard times that never come. The body is not wrong. The environment is simply the first one in 200,000 years of human existence that has genuinely bewildered the ancient instructions that guide it. As you move towards sleep now, consider what the history of hunger means for the relationship your own body has with food, the cravings you experience, the comfort you feel from a warm meal at the end of a long day, the particular satisfaction of eating something rich and calorically dense, the social warmth of sharing food with people you love. None of these are trivial or merely modern. They are the felt surface of something very old. They are the emotional and physiological residue of hundreds of thousands of years in which food was never certain, in which every successful meal was a kind of victory, in which the sharing of food was one of the most profound acts of care one human being could perform for another. When early humans sat around the fire in the evening, in the soft light of burning wood, and ate what the day had provided, whether it was much or little, they were doing something that your body recognizes in its deepest layers. The warmth of the fire, the presence of familiar others, the taste of food after a day of effort, the slowing of the body toward rest. These were the ingredients of the most reliable comfort available to a human being for most of the time our species has existed. And they remain, even now, among the most reliable comforts available to you. The weight of dinner in the deep history of our species is not merely caloric, it is existential. To eat in the evening at the end of a day, in the company of people you trust, with the shelter of walls or trees or darkness around you, this was the definition of a good day. Not every day was this. Many days ended in hunger and uncertainty and cold, but the days that ended well, that ended with food shared and the fire warm and the body nourished enough to rest, those days were the foundation of everything. They were the reward that the whole elaborate machinery of human intelligence and cooperation and cultural knowledge was built to produce. They were what all of it was for. And so tonight, as your body settles and your breathing slows and the day recedes, you are in some sense doing what your ancestors did every evening. They were fortunate enough to do it. You have eaten. The hunger is quiet. The day has asked what it asked of you, and you have answered. The body is preparing for the repair work of sleep, for the nightly restoration that ancient evolution designed to follow the exertions of the day. In the very deepest layers of your biology, something registers this as the right sequence. Effort, then food, then rest. It is a sequence older than history, older than language, older than the social forms and cultural elaborations that have grown up around the simple fact of being a body that needs to eat. The 98% of human history in which dinner was uncertain is not simply a distant and irrelevant past. It is the past that made you. It is written in the architecture of your metabolism, in the sensitivities of your taste buds, in the social warmth you feel when food is shared, in the deep satisfaction of a full stomach after genuine hunger, in the way your body slows and softens as it prepares to sleep, the luxury of a guaranteed dinner, the extraordinary improbability of the modern food supply seen against the whole sweep of human existence. These are worth knowing, if only so that the simple fact of eating tonight can carry something of its true weight. The world that shaped you was mostly a world of uncertainty, of long mornings with empty hands and careful eyes, of afternoons spent in the slow, patient negotiation between human intelligence and a landscape that did not always cooperate, of evenings around fires where the food was sometimes plentiful and sometimes scarce and always shared, and where the darkness beyond the fire held all the uncertainty that tomorrow would bring. That world is gone for most of us, in its literal form. But it is not gone from the body. The body remembers. The body still speaks in its hungers and its satisfactions and its deep relief at rest after nourishment, the language of that older world. Let the body's memory be tonight's companion. Let the ancient knowledge that you have eaten, that you are safe, that you can rest, let the knowledge settle through you now, layer by layer, the way warmth settles through cold ground when spring finally comes. You are alive. You've been fed. The long uncertainty of the day is over. In the oldest part of what you are, this is the signal to let everything else go. Slowly, gently, without effort. Let the day dissolve. Let the mind release its planning and its reviewing and its cataloguing of what was done and what remains. The fire has been lit. The meal has been shared. The darkness is safe. Whatever tomorrow will ask of you, your body and your mind will meet it better for this rest. This is what 200,000 years of human evolution designed the night for. This is what the long history of hunger and satiation and a daily negotiation with a world that offered no guarantees was always moving toward. The deep, quiet relief of having enough and being still and letting the world turn without you for a while. Sleep now. The story of dinner has been old much longer than it has been easy, and tonight it has ended well. But before sleep fully arrives, there is still more of this story worth knowing, because the history of hunger does not end with the transition to agriculture or with the emergence of stored food. It continues in different forms through every era of human civilization, and the thread that connects it all, from the earliest Homo sapiens sitting beside a fire on the African grassland to the present moment, is the same thread. The body's ancient reckoning with the world's uncertain generosity. Consider what happened to food scarcity after agriculture took hold in earnest. The Neolithic period, the era of early farming, stretched from roughly 10,000 years ago until the development of metal tools and more complex societies, perhaps 5,000 years ago or later, depending on the region. During this long transition, the relationship between human communities and their food supply was being fundamentally renegotiated. People were learning, generation by generation, how to manage domesticated plants and animals, how to select for the traits they wanted, how to store food against winter and drought, how to irrigate fields in dry climates. This was not a simple or clean process. It was full of failures and adjustments and setbacks. The earliest agricultural settlements show evidence of repeated episodes of abandonment. A community would farm a piece of land for several generations, deplete the soil nutrients that their primitive methods couldn't replenish, and eventually move on to clear new land. The pattern of early agriculture in many regions was therefore not so different in one crucial respect from the pattern of foraging. Movement was still necessary, scarcity still arrived. Communities still faced seasons and years when the food supply was insufficient. The tools were different. The scale was different. The social organization was more complex, but hunger was still there. Archaeological evidence from early farming communities in the Middle East, often called the Fertile Crescent, and long considered the cradle of agriculture, shows the same signs of nutritional stress that appear in hunter-gatherer populations: harassed lines, enamel hyperplasia, signs of iron deficiency and other micronutrient shortfalls. The transition from foraging to farming did not immediately or universally improve nutritional status. In many documented cases, it made it worse in the short term, particularly during the initial centuries of adoption when people had not yet fully optimized their farming practices and were still learning which crops grew best where, which combinations of foods maintained health, and which preparation methods made their staple grains and legumes most nutritious. One of the most important nutritional consequences of the shift to grain agriculture was the dramatic change in dietary amino acid profiles. Wild game and diverse plant foods together provide a complete range of essential amino acids, the building blocks of protein that the human body cannot synthesize on its own. Early agricultural diets based heavily on grains like wheat or barley, or on starchy root crops, often fell short in certain essential amino acids. Communities that developed grain-legume combinations, wheat with lentils, maize with beans, fared significantly better than those dependent on single, staple crops. The cultures that survived and flourished in the long run were often those whose culinary traditions had, through trial and error over generations, arrived at food combinations that happened to be nutritionally complete. Beans and rice, corn and beans and squash, the famous three sisters of Mesoamerican agriculture, wheat and lentils in the ancient Levant. These combinations were not worked out by nutritional scientists. They were worked out by hunger and observation, by communities who noticed over generations that certain eating patterns kept people healthier than others. The seasonality of food insecurity in agricultural societies took on new forms compared to the foraging past. For hunter-gatherers, scarcity was distributed across the year in patterns that varied with environment and season, but that were generally manageable through movement and flexible food choice. For farmers, scarcity was concentrated in specific seasonal and interannual crises. The hungry season, the period between when stored food from the previous harvest ran low and when the new harvest became available, was a regular feature of life in most agricultural communities throughout history. In many traditional farming societies, this hungry season fell in the late spring and early summer, when the winter stores were exhausted and the summer crops were not yet ready. It was a predictable, annual trial that communities learned to prepare for and endure. The hungry season left its mark on culture in numerous ways. Fasting traditions in many of the world's major religions fall in spring. Lent in Christian traditions, Ramadan in the Islamic calendar, various spring fasts in Jewish and Hindu practice. Whether or not these religious traditions were directly derived from the agricultural hungry season, they coincide with it in ways that are suggestive. The annual religious fast, where the community deliberately abstains from food or restricts eating, may encode in religious practice the memory of the annual period of scarcity that agricultural communities experienced for thousands of years before modern food systems eliminated the hungry season in wealthy societies. The spiritual framing of fasting, its association with purification, reflection, and connection with something larger than the individual appetite, may be the cultural and moral elaboration of an annual experience that was, at its root, simply the exhaustion of stored food before the next harvest came. Grain storage itself was one of the most transformative technologies in human nutritional history, and it's worth dwelling on what it represented. The ability to store food, to take the surplus of the good harvest and preserve it against the lean months ahead, fundamentally changed the relationship between human communities and time. Hunter-gatherers lived largely in the present tense of food acquisition. They stored some foods. Some groups smoked or dried meat, cached certain plant foods, but the scale was limited by the practicalities of the immobile lifestyle. You cannot carry large grain stores when you move through a landscape. Early farmers, by becoming sedentary, gained the ability to store at scale. And with that ability came a new kind of power, the power over future food, the power to eat tomorrow from what was secured today. This temporal extension of food security, the ability to think not just about today's meal, but about next winter's meal, was cognitively as well as practically significant. It required planning on longer timescales than food acquisition in the present required. It required the social management of shared stores, how much each family contributed, how much was drawn out when, who was responsible for the store's security and maintenance. It created new forms of social differentiation. Those who controlled the stores had power over those who depended on them. The granary, the storehouse, the communal grain pit. These are among the earliest sites of human economic inequality in the archaeological record. The person who had more grain stored had security and therefore power that the person with less did not. The abstraction of food from immediate consumption into stored resource created the conditions for new social hierarchies based on differential access to that resource. This connection between food storage and social power is one of the most important threads in the political history of food. The first governments, the early city-states of Mesopotamia, the chiefdoms of early agricultural societies, the palace economies of Bronze Age civilizations were, in large part, grain management systems. The palace or the temple served as the central repository for agricultural surplus. The administration of that surplus, its collection, its storage, its redistribution, was one of the primary functions of early government. To control the grain was to control the food supply, and to control the food supply was to control the population. The ability to withhold food or to promise food was the original form of political power. Everything that came after, the armies, the laws, the bureaucracies, the symbolic systems of legitimacy, was built on the foundation of who had the grain. This is a sobering thought about the origins of civilization. The elaborate cultural achievements of ancient urban societies, writing, monumental architecture, art, philosophy, mathematics, law, were all made possible by agricultural surplus, and the surplus was managed through systems of power that were at their core systems of differential access to food. The scribes who recorded the grain inventories in Mesopotamian temples were doing something new in human history. They were creating permanent records of food distribution. The earliest written texts in human history are not poetry or philosophy. They are accounting records. They are lists of grain. The first thing that writing was used to do in the ancient cities of Sumer was to keep track of who had the food and who owed what to whom. The history of literacy begins with hunger. The relationship between urban civilization and food scarcity is complex and full of contradictions. Cities were, from their earliest emergence, dependent on the surrounding agricultural hinterland for food. They did not grow their own food to any significant degree. They consumed the food produced by rural populations and paid for it, sometimes voluntarily through trade, sometimes coercively through taxation and tribute. The growth of cities therefore required a continuous and pliable flow of food from the countryside into the urban centre, a flow that had to be organised, protected and managed. When that flow was disrupted by drought, by military conflict that destroyed crops, by disease that killed farm labourers, by political chaos that prevented organised food distribution, urban populations starved. The great famines of ancient history were not primarily rural phenomena. They were urban ones. The concentration of population in cities created concentrated vulnerability to food supply disruption that dispersed farming and foraging communities did not face in the same way. The Roman state, at the height of the empire's power, developed one of the most sophisticated food distribution systems of the ancient world precisely because the city of Rome, a metropolis of perhaps 1 million people at its peak, could not possibly be fed by its immediate hinterland. Grain was imported from Egypt and North Africa on an enormous scale. The state organized and subsidized this grain supply and distributed it to the Roman population through a system called the annona. The free or subsidized grain dole, eventually extended to include olive oil and other staples, was one of the most politically significant institutions of the Roman state. It was not merely welfare, it was political stability. An underfed population in a great city was a political threat. The emperors understood this. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, attributed to the satirist Juvenal as a criticism of imperial policy, encapsulates a political reality that every ruler of a large urban population has understood throughout history. Keep the people fed and entertained, and they will not revolt. The distribution of food was therefore not merely an economic or logistical challenge in ancient states. It was a political imperative, and the failure to meet it had predictable consequences. Many of the great political upheavals of ancient history, the fall of dynasties, the collapse of states, the sacking of cities, were precipitated or accelerated by failures of the food supply. When people are genuinely hungry, when they face the prospect of watching their children starve, the calculus of political loyalty changes. The authority of kings and governments rests partly on their ability to provide security, and the most fundamental security is the security of food. A government that cannot feed its people is a government whose legitimacy is precarious. The history of famine in agricultural civilizations is one of the darker threads of human experience, and it runs through every major culture and every geographic region in which people have depended on cultivated crops. China, with its vast agricultural history spanning thousands of years, has a famine record that is staggering in its scope. Famines affecting tens of millions of people, recurring across centuries with terrible regularity. India, with its complex agricultural systems and vast population, experienced massive famines under various political regimes, including colonial periods when food was exported from famine-affected regions even as people died. Europe, considered relatively food secure in the modern era, was ravaged by repeated famines throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The Great Famine of the early 14th century, which combined with the subsequent Black Death to kill a third of Europe's population, stand as one of the most catastrophic nutritional disasters in Western history. These were not simply natural disasters, though natural factors like drought, floods, and plant disease played a role. They were also social and political failures. Famine typically involves not just an absolute shortage of food, but a failure of access. Food exists somewhere, but the people who need it cannot obtain it because of poverty, because of disrupted distribution systems, because of hoarding by those with power, because of political decisions that prioritize certain populations over others. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen argued in the 20th century that famines in the modern world almost never occur in functioning democracies, that they are at root political failures as much as agricultural ones. Whether or not one accepts this argument in full, it captures something important. Famine in human history has rarely been simply a matter of the land not producing enough. It has been a matter of who had access to what the land produced. The persistence of famine in agricultural civilizations highlights something important about the nature of the food security that farming was supposed to provide. Agriculture did not solve the problem of hunger, it transformed it. It replaced the daily, intimate uncertainty of the hunter-gatherer's negotiation with the landscape. Will I find food today? With the large-scale, periodic catastrophe of the crop failure or the distribution breakdown. Will the harvest come? Will the grain reach the people who need it? The scale of possible suffering increased enormously, even as the average daily reliability of food improved for many people in good agricultural years. The worst-case scenario of the agricultural world was far worse than the worst-case scenario of the foraging world. A hunter-gatherer band facing starvation might lose several members. An agricultural civilization facing famine might lose millions. It is worth noting that the experience of the hungry season, that annual period of food scarcity that agricultural communities endured, was not merely biological hardship. It was also a social and psychological experience that communities developed rich cultural resources for managing. The food cultures of traditional agricultural societies around the world include many practices that make sense only in the context of cyclical scarcity. The emphasis in many culinary traditions on extremely filling, calorie-dense foods, the value placed on the ability to prepare nourishing meals from minimal ingredients, the soups and the stews and grain porridges that appear in the food traditions of every agricultural culture, stretching ingredients across many meals, extracting maximum nutrition from minimum material. The cultural significance of hospitality and the offering food to guests and strangers, a reflection of the social insurance logic of food sharing that goes all the way back to the hunter-gatherer past. The art of making something from almost nothing, of turning bones into broth, of making bread from the coarsest grain, of picking and fermenting foods to preserve them beyond their natural season. This is one of the deep cultural inheritances of the long history of human food insecurity. Every cuisine in the world contains, somewhere in its heritage, the techniques developed by people who could not afford to waste anything. The nose-to-tail butchery of traditional food cultures, which has been rediscovered and celebrated by contemporary chefs, was not a culinary philosophy in any abstract sense in its origins. It was necessity. You used the whole animal because the animal was too valuable to waste any part of. You made stock from bones because the bones had something left to give. You cured and smoked and fermented and dried because you needed the food to last. These techniques, fermentation in particular, represent one of the most significant nutritional and preservation technologies in human history, and they predate formal agriculture. Evidence of fermented beverages dates back at least 9,000 years, and some researchers have suggested that the production of fermented grain drinks may have been one of the motivations for the initial domestication of grain crops. Whether or not fermentation was a drive of agriculture, it was certainly one of its most important companions. Fermentation, the controlled action of yeasts, bacteria, and other microorganisms on food substrates, does several things that were of enormous practical value to people managing uncertain food supplies. It preserves food beyond its natural fresh shelf life. It increases the nutritional availability of many foods, breaking down anti-nutrient compounds and, in some cases, synthesizing vitamins not present in the original food. It makes some otherwise indigestible foods digestible, and it produces compounds, alcohol, lactic acid, various flavor compounds, that have their own nutritional and social significance. The tradition of fermented foods is universal across human cultures that have moved beyond pure foraging. bread made with natural yeast fermentation, beer and wine, cheese and yogurt and kefir, miso and tempeh, kimchi and sauerkraut, vinegar, fish sauce. These are all products of fermentation, and they appear in every food culture that developed them as both practical preservation techniques and as the basis for some of the most culturally significant foods in human experience. The smell of bread rising, of wine fermenting, of cheese aging. These are among the most ancient and evocative olfactory experiences available to a human being. They are the smells of food security, of the human capacity to extend and transform the gifts of the growing season into sustenance that will last through the dark months. Considering the full arc of human food history, from the early Homo sapiens on the African savanna to the early farmers of the Neolithic, through the urban civilizations of antiquity and the agricultural societies of the medieval world, one thread remains constant through all of it, the thread of uncertainty, of not knowing at any given moment, in any given season, in any given year, whether there would be enough, whether the rains would come, whether the harvest would be good, whether the hunt would succeed, whether the stored grain would last until spring, whether the ships carrying food to the city would arrive safely, whether the political situation would allow food to reach the people who needed it. This uncertainty was the fundamental condition of human nutritional existence for nearly the entire history of our species, and it shaped us. It shaped our biology, our cognition, our social institutions, our cultural practices, our spiritual lives, our emotional relationships with food and with each other. The human body and mind that exist today, that you carry with you into sleep tonight, were forged in that uncertainty. They are its products in the most direct sense. Every adaptation that makes you was, in some part, refined by the pressure of this most ancient of challenges. Find food, share it, survive. The modern world has, for the first time in human history, created conditions in which a significant portion of humanity lives with genuine food security, where the question of whether dinner will arrive tonight has for many people been definitively and reliably answered in the affirmative. This is one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of our species. It is the product of thousands of years of accumulated agricultural knowledge, of technological development, of political and economic organization, of scientific understanding applied to food production and preservation and distribution. It is not a small thing. It is, measured against the full sweep of human history, an almost miraculous thing. And yet, as we have seen, it comes with its Russian complications. The body that now has reliable access to food is the same body that was designed for unreliable access. The metabolic systems, the hormonal responses, the cognitive and emotional relationships with eating, these are ancient instruments being played in a new context, and the music is not always harmonious. The diseases of metabolic surplus, the obesity, the diabetes, the cardiovascular disease that are among the most significant health challenges of modern wealthy societies represent the body's ancient programming encountering an environment that its evolutionary history did not prepare it for. This is not a moral failing. It is a biological consequence of living in the first era of human history when food security for many people has been genuinely achieved. What the history of dinner teaches in its long and patient unfolding is a kind of humility about the human situation. We are recent arrivals in this condition of abundance. Our bodies do not fully trust it yet. Our hormones still send hunger signals calibrated for a world of scarcity. Our metabolic systems still prime us to eat more than we need when food's available, because availability was never guaranteed in the world that shaped us. Our social and emotional responses to food still carry the warmth and the weight of hundreds of thousands of years of sharing in conditions of uncertainty. These are not weaknesses to be corrected or indulgences to be criticized. They are the marks of a history written in flesh and bone and cell. To understand the history of food insecurity is not to be depressed by it. It is to be humbled by it, and perhaps unexpectedly to be grateful in a way that goes deeper than social convention. When you eat tonight, when you sit with a food that's warm and available and sufficient, you are participating in something that your ancestors did under conditions of profound uncertainty for virtually the entire duration of the human story. They went to considerable effort, physical and cognitive and social and cultural, to make those moments happen. They built their intelligence and their communities and their cultural knowledge around the project of making those moments happen. The dinner you ate tonight, however ordinary it seemed, stands at the end of that long effort. This is a thought worth carrying into sleep. Not a thought that makes you anxious or burdened, but a thought that settles softly, like the last light going out of the sky. You have eaten. The day has provided what it needed to provide. The ancient question, where is the food? Will it come? Will it be enough? Has been answered tonight in your favour, and the body knows this in its oldest knowledge and is ready to rest. The quality of rest is different when you carry this understanding, even lightly. The satisfaction of a fed body is not merely the mechanical absence of hunger, it is the fulfillment of the oldest requirement, the answering of the question that every human body is asked every day for 200,000 years. In the quiet of this moment, with the sounds of the world settling around you, the body releases the vigilance that hunger requires. The metabolic systems that keep you alert to opportunity and threat soften their intensity. The mind, which has been running its ancient food-finding algorithms all day, planning, navigating, acquiring, allocating, permits itself to disengage. The transition from waking to sleep is, among other things, the body's most ancient form of trust. The trust that you have done enough for today, that tonight you can rest, that tomorrow will bring what it brings, and you will meet it from the foundation of this rest. Across 200,000 years, on every continent, in every climate, under skies ranging from equatorial to arctic, human beings have lain down at the end of their days and let consciousness go. Most of them did not know what the next day would bring. Many of them went to sleep with hunger still present in their bodies. But the ones who woke to face the next morning, who rose and continued the long project of human survival and community and knowledge building and love, they carried forward the thread that eventually arrived through countless generations of endurance and ingenuity at you. You are the latest point in a line of survivors. Every one of your ancestors, without exception, made it through enough days and nights to pass their lives forward, through the lean seasons and the failed hunts and the terrible famines and all the daily uncertainties of a world that never guaranteed tomorrow. They made it through, and now you are here, at the end of a day, fed, whatever shelter you have, preparing to rest, and the deep evolutionary intelligence of the body that they gave you recognizes this moment. It has been waiting for it. It knows what to do with it. Let everything go quiet now. Let the breath slow and deepen. let the images of the day dissolve into formlessness. The ancient grasslands are still, the fires burning low, the band settled into the rhythms of sleep around you. The darkness is safe, the food has been found and shared. Tomorrow is still a mystery, as tomorrow always has been, as tomorrow always will be. But tonight is complete. Sleep gently, sleep deeply. The long history of hunger has brought you, through every twist and crisis and adaptation, to this night and this rest. And in this rest, as in every rest that every human being has taken at the end of every fed and sheltered night, in all the 200,000 years of our existence, something continues, something that a hunger sharpened and community protected and culture carried and love sustained, something that is at its core simply the human body's doing what it was designed by the long pressure of history to do, rest, and let tomorrow be tomorrow. There's one more thread worth following before the mind truly lets go. It is the thread of what food meant not just as survival but as meaning, as the substance around which human beings built their understanding of the world, their relationships with the sacred, and their sense of who they were. In every human culture ever documented, food occupies a central place in the ceremonial and spiritual life of the community. This is so universal and so consistent that it can only be explained by the depth of food's significance in the ancestral environment. When something is this important, this deeply connected to survival, to community, to the daily negotiation with life itself, it does not remain merely practical. It becomes sacred. It becomes the medium through which people express the deepest truths they know about existence. The practice of offering food to gods and spirits is among the oldest religious behaviors in the archaeological record. In ancient Mesopotamia, the temples were fed daily. The divine statues were presented with elaborate meals, given water for washing, dressed and perfumed and entertained, because the gods were understood as beings with the same needs as humans, and feeding them was both an act of respect and an insurance policy. In ancient Egypt, the elaborate mortuary offerings, the bread and beer and cuts of meat placed in tombs to sustain the dead in the afterlife, reflected an understanding that food was so fundamental to existence that even the dead required it. In ancient Greece and Rome, virtually every religious ceremony involved the sacrifice of animals, whose meat was then cooked and shared among the worshippers. The gods received the smoke and the bones and the fat. The people received the meat. The sacrifice was simultaneously a gift to the divine and a communal feast, a religious act and a nutritional one, and the two dimensions were inseparable. This fusion of the sacred and the nutritional is not incidental. It reflects the genuine weight that food carried in human experience. The moment of eating, of taking the substance of the world into your body, of converting the life of plants and animals into your own continued life, is a moment of profound intimacy between the individual and the world. In a world where food was uncertain, this moment was also a moment of profound gratitude. You did not always know if you would have food. When you did, the experience of having it was heightened by the knowledge of how it might have gone otherwise. The thanks that ancient peoples gave for food, to their gods, to the spirits of the animals they killed, to the powers they understood to govern rain and sun and soil, were not empty ritual. They were the authentic expression of people who understood, in their bodies and in their history, exactly what it meant to receive what they needed. The grace said, before a meal in religious traditions around the world, the Jewish blessing over bread, the Christian prayer of thanks, the Islamic basmala spoken before eating, the Buddhist mindfulness practice around food. These are all contemporary echoes of an ancient recognition. Food is not nothing. Its arrival is not automatic. It is the product of a world that does not owe it to you. And its presence on your table is a gift that has been preceded by extraordinary effort, uncertainty, and good fortune across an enormous chain of cause and effect reaching back further than you can easily imagine. Understanding the food on your table as the end product of that chain, as the resolution of 200,000 years of uncertain negotiation between the human species and the world's variable generosity, does not require religion. It requires only a certain quality of attention, the kind of attention that slow history encourages, the kind that sees an ordinary piece of bread and understands that it connects you through an unbroken thread of human effort and knowledge and survival to the first person who ground grain between stones and mixed it with water and set it near a fire and discovered that something new had been created. To every farmer who saved seed through a hard winter so that spring planting could happen. To every mother who stretched the lot of the grain through the hungry days before the harvest. To every culture that developed the knowledge of how to turn raw materials into sustaining food, and pass that knowledge forward through generations of careful teaching, you are the recipient of all of that. Every dinner you have ever eaten has arrived at your hands through that long chain of human knowledge, labour, care, and survival. This is not a heavy thought. It is, in the right light, a comforting one. You're not alone in this. You have never been alone in this. The entire project of human history, one of its most important dimensions, has been organised around the problem of making sure that people could eat. And tonight, that project succeeded on your behalf, as it has succeeded on your behalf every day of your life. This success is not something to take for granted, not because taking it for granted is immoral, but because the full appreciation of it is one of the simplest and most reliable sources of genuine contentment available to a human being. The philosopher who asked what it means to have enough was asking of the oldest questions in human experience. For most of human history, having enough meant something very specific and very concrete. Having eaten today, having something to eat tomorrow, having the people you loved close enough to share what you had. The elaborations of what enough means have grown more complex with the growth of civilization. But the foundation has not changed. It is still at its root, the warm stomach and the settled body and the sense that the day has provided what it needed to provide. There is quality to this kind of contentment, the contentment of physical nourishment, that is different from the contentment of achievement or approval or acquisition. It is older. It is more somatic, more directly tied to the body's experience. It does not require thought or judgment or the comparison of your situation with anyone else's. It simply is. The body that has eaten is, in some fundamental register, at peace with the world in a way that no other condition quite replicates. This is the peace that the entire evolutionary history of hunger was building toward. In every individual moment when the hunt succeeded, or the harvest was sufficient, or the sharing of the band's resources meant that no one went to sleep entirely without. That peace is available to you tonight. It has been available to your kind in their best moments, for as long as your kind has existed. Let it be available now. Let the body have its ancient satisfaction. Let the mind release its forward planning and its backward reviewing and rest in the simple, present tense of a fed body settling towards sleep. The grasslands are quiet, the fires are low, the darkness beyond the firelight is no longer threatening, because the body has what it needs to face whatever the darkness might bring. The sentinel systems of hunger and vigilance are lowering their watch. The rest systems are rising, the hormones of sleep beginning their slow accumulation, the brain beginning its nightly withdrawal from the external world into its own deep rhythms of restoration. Somewhere in your body's nightly biochemistry, the same processes that have occurred every night in every sleeping human body for 200,000 years are beginning. Growth hormone is released in the early deep sleep phases, beginning the work of cellular repair and renewal that the waking hours do not. The immune system does some of its most intensive work during sleep, reviewing and updating its defenses. Memory consolidation occurs, the events of the day being processed, some held and some released, the useful learning encoded into long-term memory while the irrelevant details fade. The emotional processing that REM sleep performs, the strange associative logic of dreams, works through the emotional residue of experience and prepares the mind for another day of engagement with the world. These are not trivial processes. They are among the most important things a human body does, and they happen, by and large, at night, in sleep, in the recovery time that the body requires after the effort and input of the day. In the ancestral world, this recovery time was arranged by the natural rhythm of light and dark. The sun went down, the fire burned, the community settled. Darkness was not merely the absence of light, it was the signal, written deep into human biology through hundreds of thousands of years of association, that the day's active demands had ended and the body's repair system should take over. The hormone melatonin, produced by the pineal gland in response to darkness, began its nightly rise, carrying the signal of sleep through this bloodstream. The core body temperature began its nightly decline. The brain's activity patterns shifted. The world narrowed from the vast attentional field of the waking day to the intimate darkness behind closed eyes. This is what is happening to you now, or what can happen to you now if you allow it. The same ancient signals are present. The body knows the darkness, the body knows the hour. The body knows that the day's work, including the work of finding and eating food, has been completed, and that rest is what comes next. 200,000 years of this rhythm have written it into the architecture of your biology. You do not need to do anything to make it happen. You only need to allow it. The food you ate tonight is already being processed by the remarkable network of organs and systems that constitute your digestive apparatus. The stomach is working. The small intestine is absorbing. The liver is processing. The nutrients from your meal are being carried through your bloodstream to the cells that need them. The body is doing, in the quiet of the night, the same patient work that every human body has done after every meal since the first members of our species learned to eat and rest and trust the night. There is nothing you need to add to this process. It is ancient, and it knows what to do. The ancestors who did not survive to pass their genes forward, the ones who could not tolerate the lean seasons, who became incapacitated by hunger too quickly, whose metabolisms could not make the shift from abundance to scarcity back, they are not your ancestors. The ones who could were. And through that long selection, the human body became something extraordinary, a system capable of profound adaptation, capable of finding sustenance in harsh environments, capable of enduring scarcity and then recovering fully from it, capable of storing abundance against future need, capable of the full range of metabolic states from feast to fast and back again. That is the body you have. That is the inheritance of the long history you have been travelling through tonight. And that body is doing one of the simplest and most important things it can do. It is resting after being fed, not with the anxious rest of a hungry animal that has not yet secured what it needs, not with the fitful rest of someone uncertain whether tomorrow will be sufficient, but with the deep rest of a body that has been given what it needs and can now devote its full resources to repair and renewal, to the nightly work of rebuilding what the day consumed and preparing for the demands of what comes next. This is the gift of the end of the day. This is what the whole arc of human food history was working toward, in its patient, uncertain, often painful way. Not just survival, not just the bare continuation of the species, but this, a human body fed and sheltered, lying down in safety, releasing the day's vigilance, entering the restorative darkness of sleep with the ancient animal trust that, tonight, what was needed has been provided. The Weich is low, the band is still. The world is turning in the darkness, carrying its old rhythms of season and light of growth and harvest and rest. Somewhere out beyond the walls, the night is doing what nights do. And here, in the warmth of the space you have made for yourself in the world, the body is doing what bodies do after the ancient question has been answered. The question was, will there be enough? Tonight to their eyes. Sleep now, sleep well. The long history of dinner has earned you this rest.